All right, episode 8. We are remote. Vic is in the office downtown Nashville, and I am in a room in a lodge somewhere on Main Street in Aspen, Colorado. It's been an incredible event. They are able to really draw out the leaders, at least of healthcare in the United States. And so we'll talk through some of the sessions that I sat in on with the FDA commissioner as well as the HHS secretary. So we'll go through that. But I think we've got some news that we're going to cover first that you've been tracking while I've been in transit.
Yeah.
Yeah, why don't you jump into the first story?
Yeah. So I'll see if I can share this. So we've been warning our portfolio companies and investors about how hard the fundraising environment is. And I think that hasn't changed. But it also, I think, is valuable to point out successes. And so Aledade is a physician enablement platform in Maryland. They really have a nationwide reach. And they raised $260 million. I think it came out yesterday. And so that's exciting and great. And as we have talked about, before, I think on the show, primary care is really a great place for innovation. There's a lot of progress, both in how primary care groups, how many primary care physicians and the groups organize themselves, and also sort of as the entry point for value-based care. And I think this is a success story there, alongside other success stories. So good to sort of just note that. I don't think it makes the environment easy overall, but good to celebrate a successful raise. I wanted to point out that the employment of docs. So for a long time, most physicians were independent, and that's been trending to where they're being employed either by health systems. You can see it's, the last data we had was in 22, 52% now are employed by health systems. And it's been up 26% since 2012. So huge growth there. And then that blue category is what we're talking about with Aledade. That's now almost a quarter of the docs are in a private equity backed company, either in physician enablement or in what we call advanced primary care. I think we should maybe talk about the differences there, but they're both private equity managed groups.
Yeah, and then it looks like the independent decrease has been from 2019 to 2022, which obviously that's the pandemic era.
Right.
So I'm sure there's some influence there, but a 12% decrease, that's a very sharp decrease in such a short time window.
Right.
Not including the what's happened this year, because this trend line ends in 2022. So that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, and I think as you can tell from the graph, hospitals are gaining share of docs, but really private equity is an entry that's growing pretty dramatically. And we don't have it back to 2012, but I think it was very low, approaching zero in 2010, 2012. And so they've taken a lot of share.
Yeah, I mean, the fastest growing category here is PE or other.
Right.
And that makes a lot of sense in terms of primary care certainly being a key area, whether it be advanced primary care or focused on sort of employer-focused networks. But to see that being the leading growth category is pretty interesting. And I wonder sort of how to think about that in light of everything that happened with Envision, and HCA's joint venture with them, and HCA's sort of strong position versus Envision's not so strong position, and ultimate bankruptcy. I think there's probably more to this story that's going to play out over time, and we're going to have to keep an eye on this, because I think the health systems are likely going to be a much more stable base for these physicians, whereas these different investor-backed vehicles may flame out.
Yeah, and I think that's a good segue to the difference between advanced primary care and enablement platforms. They're very related. They're both private equity strategies. Of course, some of the advanced primary cares have been acquired. One Medical got bought by Amazon. Oak Street got bought by CVS/Aetna. But at first they were private equity backed. The enablement platforms are very capital light. So they don't take a lot of capital. The way it works is they provide technology services and support, but then the docs stay on their own payroll. They keep all the capital costs, and then they kind of share the upside. And so I think that is it's a strong cash flow generating business model if you can help the docs be much better at affordable care and value-based care. It's great. The advanced primary care is more capital intensive.
Yes.
And I think part of the reason for the exits is you need a lot of capital to play that game over the long term. I think with private equity controlling or at least influencing more of the primary care segment, I think you do get to a point where you have at least competing incentives. Private equity is trying to make profits as their primary thing. And so there's an opportunity to run kind of strategies that maybe aren't necessarily the best long-term strategy. I don't want to go through the whole Envision thing, but I think, that you could put debt on the company, you could pay a dividend. There's lots of strategies that private equity, when they don't work well, have been criticized for. And I think there's going to be a reckoning where we have to try to balance the creativity and the empowerment that private equity, bringing new software tools and new strategies can be really helpful, but also try to avoid some of the less good effects of it.
Yeah, I think that's right. There are so many factors. I mean, some of it, and one thing we haven't talked at all about is really where do physicians want to be, right? Yeah. I'll come back to this in detail, but a lot of the comments that Commissioner Califf made when just talking about a lot of the changes we've had over the last 20 years as it pertains to physicians, he consistently used a term that ZDoggMD actually introduced to me, which was moral injury, right? Yeah. As opposed to using the burnout term. He consistently used the term moral injury. And, I think in a lot of these advanced primary care platforms, they are generally pretty physician friendly, insofar as they focus on deep patient relationships. And, sort of the primary care physician being, pretty much the quarterback for care, with a lot of data capture capabilities and a lot of care coordination capabilities. And so I think there's probably more and more physicians that are opting in to that model, which doesn't necessarily tell us how sustainable that model is going to be, right? Or how profitable it's going to be. But there's going to be a higher level of affinity because it is a more physician-friendly model in a world that hasn't been very physician-friendly for a while.
Yeah. I was talking to a startup, which is a very different proposition yesterday, and they're selling a different tool to docs. It's really it's like an enable tool, but really thin. And what they're seeing in their customer discovery is docs want to just come into work, practice medicine, take care of their patients, and not have to worry about all of the administrative back office data collection, billing stuff. Although they want the business to work, they want to be paid appropriately, and so getting that balance, I think, is the key.
Yep. You talked about Aledade. I think it's also worth calling out the CEO, Farzad Mostashari. He's, a rock star, used to run health IT for HHS. And when you look at the list of the VCs that are there, it's a pretty big brand hit list. Yeah. I think I saw Lightspeed, Omer's. Right. Who else was on the list?
Venrock. Venrock. Pretty good. Fidelity is a.
Yeah. So when we talk about sort of the winter, there are going to be those people who they're so well respected, they're so
Yeah,
connected, that they can continue to access capital even in a window like
right,
this, right? But that is not, everyone is not this guy.
right.
So, we need to kind of keep that in perspective, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think they are at the I couldn't get the exact data, but roughly 300 to 350 million in revenue. Um,
It's pretty good.
Cash flow positive. So it's a different
Yeah.
animal than a lot of portfolio companies that we interact with. The other thing I'll point out is that they did a partnership with Elevance, the former Anthem,
Anthem.
um, and that in that partnership they assumed they got all of the Elevance docs onto their platform. That was last summer, and so I don't have
Okay.
data on it, but I think that's probably paying off really well because that's a big platform.
Yeah. Yeah, and look, just continued shift towards the pay vider model, I think, creates these innovation opportunities. I think this is a theme we've been talking about.
Yeah,
It is a good thing, I believe, ultimately, because not all the pay viders are going to have the kinds of uh, strength that a UHG has to do so many of these things internally. And
yeah,
so there's going to be lots of opportunity for partnership, acquisition. Not to say that UHG isn't doing these things, but they've established the pay vider model for such a much longer time that Optum is such a built out machine at this point.
yeah,
Whereas, your Anthems, your Evernorths, et cetera, I think they are going to be very, very open in order to catch up, quite frankly.
right.
They're going to be very open to partnerships.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. And then I was going to just touch on uh, Amazon. So Amazon has their own. Of course, they bought One Medical, so they have an advanced primary care practice where you go in and see a doc in the One Medical platform. But last November, they also launched um, an Amazon clinic. I'll show you the website there. So it's a fully
Okay.
automated. Um, you don't you don't talk to anyone. You key in what your symptoms are, and then there's a chat, largely automated chat function. And I didn't really give it much consideration. It's sort of another in the Amazon suite of tools. I seem
Mm-hmm.
sort of complementary with One Medical, um, but there's a lot of attention in DC around this because Washington Post came out with an article that Amazon changed the HIPAA authorization form. So we all have, whenever we go to the doctor, you always sign that HIPAA form when you check in. And honestly,
Yep.
I don't read it very carefully. It just gives my
Who
doctor,
does?
yeah, who does exactly? And the Washington Post does is the answer. Um, they read it, and the quote that I thought, it's a long article, but Senators Warren and Welsh uh, took Amazon to task in a conference this week,
Hmm.
because what they have inserted into the authorization is a much broader authorization. So when you sign up to this online form and you get your medication, or you get, maybe you have a sore throat or whatever, you
Mm-hmm.
also agree to give Amazon access to your complete patient record, which is a little bit vague what that means, but it sort of implies all of your medical records. But then
Okay.
further, you give them the right to redisclose that information for other purposes that are only known to Amazon. And so the Washington Post, I think correctly, is calling this out as a bridge too far. It's great that they have this patient convenience. At least in my opinion, it's great to have an alternative for folks, but they shouldn't have a broader HIPAA release than anyone else does.
Right. Right.
So it seems like
Huh.
Senators Warren and Welsh are on it. Amazon has not changed it as of yet, but I think they're going to have to.
Yeah. This is. I mean, I think the thing that I wonder about this is the resources that will be required to police all of these kinds of new applications that are coming out.
Yeah.
It just seems like it just seems like unless there is uh, some true line drawing around what's legal and what's not legal, this gray area is going to be taken advantage of by a ton of companies.
Yeah.
Some of them as large as Amazon, but a lot of them smaller, just venture-backed companies that are trying to break into the space, right? I mean, I think we're just going to see a lot more of this. And I haven't actually read the terms or the HIPAA disclosure, so I'm not going to opine deeply on it. But I think if we just think about the macro challenges around labor, around access, everyone keeps talking about these things. I think what Amazon is providing here is certainly something to celebrate in terms of trying to expand access to people, but the safety of it and the privacy protection around it, it's just trade-offs. It's just more and more and more trade-offs. And as long as we continue to not have good answers, as long as we continue to in aggregate increase the cost of healthcare in this country, as long as we continue to have lowering life expectancy, I think people are going to have less and less compassion for government deciding these things are inappropriate, because all of the important metrics, whether they be financial or health related, are all going in the wrong direction. So it's like, what are we going to do? You know what I mean? And I think these companies are very, very good.
With big systems in DC that you met with today, so you can give us a report on it in a minute, but they haven't had great results. And so I think we do need consumer protection, but I also think it's great that Amazon's bringing new ideas to market. So that we have to figure out a balance there, but I don't know what it is. I mean, I can certainly imagine my health data being really beneficial for Amazon selling me other stuff through one of their other channels. I mean, they sell everything.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I haven't read the article in the Washington Post, and that's a derivative of the actual document, right? So I'm going to hold off on any strong opinion or judgment on it, right? But I just think that even by the admission of the leaders in government, we are clearly not doing a good job in translating our massive lead in innovation in terms of medicine, surgical procedures, cell therapies, all these things we as a country are leading in. It's not translating into better outcomes, and it's certainly not translated into lower cost of care, right? And there's no evaluation of cost effectiveness going on. So I think it's going to be hard over time to continue to try to hold off the Amazons of the world from doing things like this.
So maybe it is the consumer has to educate themselves.
Yeah, fat chance of that. I mean, I've got more belief we're going to properly regulate this than consumers are going to educate themselves. I mean, we spend how much time every week doing this show to try to educate ourselves. Yeah. And I wouldn't call ourselves very educated. Right.
Yeah. I never read the HIPAA things, and now apparently I need to. So.
Right. That's my point. Right. That's my point. We study this every week, and how well do you know all the HIPAA disclosures that you've signed over the last year?
Not at all.
Right. So, all right.
Well,
it's something to track, though, right? Yeah. I mean, it's something to track. I think from our perspective as venture investors, what happens to Amazon that they can maybe defend with lawyers and lobbyists, certainly early stage companies cannot, right? So this could end up bringing some, at a minimum, negative headwinds from a political discourse perspective around these types of innovations. And it could be yet another category that, kind of catches pneumonia while Amazon maybe catches a slight cold.
Right. Okay, well, that's probably a good point to go to our sponsor, and then we can come back and hear about Aspen.
Sounds good.
Thanks, guys, for the opportunity to talk about our pre-seed fund, Jumpstart Foundry. My name is Doug Edwards, CEO of Jumpstart Health Investors, the parent company of Jumpstart Foundry. We're so excited to be able to talk about early stage venture investing, certainly the need for us to change the crazy world of healthcare in the United States. We are spending 20% of our GDP, north of $4 trillion a year on healthcare with suboptimal outcomes. Jumpstart Foundry exists to help us find and identify and invest in innovative companies that are going to make a difference in healthcare in our country. Every year, Jumpstart Foundry invests a fund, raises a fund, and deploys that across 30, 40, 50 assets every year, allowing ease of access for our limited partners to invest to help us make something better in healthcare. Some of the benefits of Jumpstart Foundry is there's no management fees. We deploy all the capital that's raised every year in the fund. We find the best and brightest, typically around single-digit percentage of companies that apply for funding from Jumpstart, and we invest in the most incredible, robust, innovative solutions and founders in the United States. Over the last 9 years, Jumpstart Foundry has invested in nearly 200 early-stage, pre-seed stage companies in the country. Through those most innovative solutions that Jumpstart Foundry invests in, we also provide great returns and a great experience for our limited partners. We partner with AngelList to administer the fund, making that ease of access not only with low minimums, but the ease of investing in venture much better. We all know that healthcare is broken. Everyone deserves better. Come alongside us with Jumpstart Foundry, invest in making the future of healthcare better, and make something better in healthcare. Thank you, guys. Now back to the show.
All right, we're back. So maybe I'll just start at the highest level and talk about this event that I'm at.
So what it is. I'm not sure everyone knows what it is.
Yeah, so we've only done 8 episodes, and 2 of the 8 episodes I've done from Aspen, Colorado. So this is not the same thing that I was here for last time. Last time I was here doing an executive seminar, and there was almost nobody on the Aspen Institute campus. But this time there's a lot of people here. So around this time every year they throw an event called the Aspen Ideas Festival, and it's a very, very big, high profile event. Lots of people from across different industries come. But what they've been doing, I think it's less than 10 years, is a pre-conference, a pre-festival to the actual Aspen Ideas Festival that's entirely focused on health. So it's called Aspen Ideas Health. It started on Wednesday and it goes until Sunday, and then Aspen Ideas starts on, it goes until Saturday, and then Aspen Ideas starts on Sunday and then kind of goes for the next week. So Aspen Institute, very, very, well-respected organization in DC, and therefore they're able to really bring out the heavy hitters from DC. And this year, in addition to, Chelsea Clinton and, a bunch of, top people in the nonprofit space, they actually had not just, actually, they had the HHS secretary current, Javier Becerra, but they also had previous ones as well. So Aledade was here. The FDA commissioner, Robert Califf was here this morning, and they've got NBC journalists as well as CNN journalists doing the interviews. So it's pretty great.
You get a really good interview. You get a really good Q&A session because you have a journalist doing it.
You have professional journalists doing it, right? So it's not like some person who works at the Aspen Institute doing it who might lob softballs or might not know how to handle someone trying to duck and dodge answering questions. We're getting kind of TV quality interviews, which is really, really good. And they're also long form, so they get to talk about a lot of stuff. So that was really great. So we've got a couple of pictures. You can for anyone who's viewing this on YouTube, which, by the way, just quick shout out. We do spend time to try to curate these slides and bring different visuals. I know podcast is the by far most dominant way that people like to consume our show, but do want to encourage you, if you're into actually seeing any of these slides or images, we're on YouTube. Just, you can put health further into the search, and you'll be able to find us. And obviously, we'd love for you to subscribe and share with other people because, we do put a fair amount of work into that. But Robert Califf was interviewed by Bertha Coombs, who actually did an interview with me when I launched Jumpstart Nova. So shout out to Bertha. And I've got a long list of notes. So this is going to sound crazy, but I think I'm just going to like go through all the different things that he touched on because he touched on a ton of things.
Yeah.
And at any point, Vic, why don't you just like interrupt me and say, hey,
Yeah,
let's
I'll
let's
jump in.
let's.
I have a couple questions already that I want to make sure I touch on. But yeah, just how did he start, and what are your comments from the meeting? I mean, the FDA
Yeah. So
is huge. FDA and HHS control half of healthcare, so
this is massive. The only thing they didn't have was the head of CMS there. I mean, but like, the CMS administrator, but like this is a big deal, right? So so the first question was about the fact that this is his second run as commissioner,
Yeah.
and just sort of asking him what was different between the first run and the second run. And the main thing that he said was that this time around the country is clearly just much more divided, and so it's just a much less genteel environment. But he said because it's a second time, he knows his way around a lot better, and so he's able to navigate, an even more difficult climate. So that was his primary thing, which I don't think would surprise anybody. There's quite a bit of conversation about the Alzheimer's drug approval. He mostly was non-responsive to that topic, I think, because it's still in play. But he used that, I think, to mostly sort of segue into the relationship between FDA and CMS, and really sort of focused on the fact that we don't have a good handoff between the FDA and their final work into the CMS and the beginning of their work. And he articulated it that it really should be like a smooth baton handoff in a relay race. And it's not. And so what you end up having are these two organizations that have different mandates, and the way that he framed those were the FDA is about making sure that things are safe and effective, whereas CMS is about making sure that things are reasonable and necessary, right? And FDA shouldn't be meddling in CMS's business, and CMS shouldn't be meddling in FDA's business. However, if we're actually going to translate all these breakthroughs that the FDA does ultimately determine are safe and effective, we have to have a better handoff. And that got into a conversation that was mostly a comparison of the US health system versus other health systems around the world. A lot of conversation about the UK and the fact that they have a unified, EMR system, and that allows for outcome tracking when you release new therapies into the market in a way that we cannot do here. He highlighted the lack of interoperability across the healthcare system in the United States, and the fact that the incentives are designed in such a way that different organizations want to hold their data to themselves. And so that literally gets in the way of translational medicine being rolled out in an effective way, and CMS being able to figure out how to pay for things more quickly, because CMS's ability to determine whether something's reasonable and necessary is much more based on broad outcomes for the whole population, whereas the FDA is always working within the clinical trials framework, which is representative of the whole population, but economically does not actually represent the whole population.
Well, let's pause on that for a second, because the transparency in data topic, I think, is very related to that, where lots of people are pushing for more and more transparency. I think HHS has been driving that, but health systems and payers are either resisting it or meeting it in a less than ideal way. But I think we're chipping away at that, more slowly than I would like. But I think we're making progress there, although it's not like the UK, definitely.
No, it's not. Actually, I'm going to leave from here on Saturday, and Sunday starts the HFMA's annual conference. And one of the big topics is going to be interoperability, and a growing sense that enforcement for interoperability is actually finally coming, probably towards the back half of the year. Obviously, the health systems have pretty much been in lockstep that, until there is real enforcement, we're not doing anything about this. We got, mostly we got bigger fish to fry. I don't think it's so much like we're totally unwilling. It's just like, until you really, really make us do it, we're not going to do it. But I know that it's going to be one of the big topics for next week's conference there. So I agree with you. I think we've talked in previous episodes about the bills that are happening in the House around transparency, around interoperability. it's happening, but it is slow. It is slow, and there's a general lack of enforcement to really drive it. So, I mean, my sense is this was an area that the commissioner was pretty frustrated in and didn't feel like he had a ton of leverage or capability to change the way it is. He was just sort of pointing it out.
Yeah. Right. Right. Okay.
Another really big topic was about just pharma in general, and I would say two main areas. One, accelerated approval. So this was sort of not talking specifically about the Alzheimer's situation, but talking about
accelerated approval. Alzheimer's, I think, was done
that's right.
Accelerated approval. Yeah.
It was, which was why he went to accelerated approval as an overall topic of discussion, right? Again, he would not dig too much into the Alzheimer's case, but he was talking about all the things sort of around it, right? And so he talked about accelerated approval, and one thing I totally agreed with that he said accelerated approval is a reflection of the American personality to take more risk, especially in the face of a terminal disease, which I totally agree with. And when he framed it that way, it made me sort of feel like it's inevitable that this is going to continue to be politically popular, to continue to advance, right to try, accelerated approval things, especially for rare diseases where outcomes are almost always terminal. I just had a sense that he was of the belief, and he even talked about, how it was something that had saved his mother's life. So he gave a personal testimony about that. So my sense is he is going to continue to push for accelerated approval. He did make the point that, as the commissioner, he doesn't actually do any of the actual approvals. He works at things at the systems level. But I think at the systems level, he is pretty pro accelerated approval.
Yeah. That's a good place to touch on the difference between the mandate for FDA and the mandate for CMS. From my point, like Congress, I think,
yes,
because of popular demand or because they're politicians, they passed accelerated approval, but they didn't tell CMS, I don't think, that you have to cover these things. And there's a lot less data in accelerated approval. They just don't have, CMS doesn't have as much to work with, really.
Yeah. So let's stick a pin in that and come back to it when we get to HHS, because that gets into the entire conversation around just the relationship between the government and pharmaceutical companies and their ability to negotiate, which I think is just an overall shift in positioning. But we'll stick a pin and we'll come back to that. Okay. Yeah. So actually, the next topic was all around the IRA, the 9-year limit on small molecule drugs, and just generally the vast differences between the innovative drug industry and the generic drug industry. And I actually had a conversation last night with one of the co-founders of Civica, a guy named Carter Dredge, who's a C-level at SSM, which is based in St. Louis. Yeah. Amazing guy. He's in my Health Innovators Fellowship.
I like Civica. I don't know him.
Oh yeah, no. Well, he's amazing. Civica is fantastic, and it was great.
Explain what they do.
Yeah. So Civica is a nonprofit that really is formed sort of as a consortium of health systems who were dealing with this fundamental problem in the generic space, which is we basically have a supply and price challenge where generics, by the nature of what they are, generics, there's no defensibility to them. Okay. And so what that means is that it's really a race to the bottom. And the bottom is a place where between group purchasing and these scaled out distributors and their relationships and the way that they work together, the price for a generic can get so low that you lose money. Like if you're a network, you lose money if you're selling that drug. And so you don't sell it or you don't prioritize it or whatever. And what that is leading to.
I mean, where the real conflict is, I wasn't in the meeting, so maybe they didn't talk about this, but if you make it outside the U.S., it is almost always cheaper. But
yes,
it's not.
That was a massive part.
Okay, yeah.
That was a massive part of the conversation, right? Which is you simply cannot, at the end of the day, the generic business is about lowest cost. and you cannot manufacture low cost in America anymore. You cannot do it. And so you get to this place where, again, things are getting manufactured in India or whatever. The FDA commissioner framed this as an issue of national security, but it doesn't change the economic problem, which is when there's not an obvious path to profit, which many generics are resulting in a lack of a path to profit, then you have supply chain issues and you have availability issues.
No one's gonna build an insulin production facility because they don't know that they can make any money on it.
They don't know they can make any money, right? There's nothing to stop them from losing to an offshore competitor, right? This is exactly the problem. And so Civica basically recognized this fundamental flaw in the economic model and said, look, we need these generic drugs. And so they basically have created their own their own entity to sort of manage this
their own production.
Yeah, it's not just buying; it's down to production. So they really are sort of they've created their own nonprofit pharma company that is that's focused entirely on generics with the purpose. The purpose is not to make profit. The purpose is to ensure availability, right? And to make sure that people who need the drugs can get the drugs that they need. So anyway, Civic is fantastic. Carter, shout out to you, man. You're a great dude. But anyway, this is an FDA level problem, and the way that the commissioner framed it was this is a national security issue. So didn't really have like a great answer for it, because when you look at the economic model, generics drive low cost, and if the cost is such that you have no competitive protections from offshoring and you have no guarantee that you're going to make a profit, which actually gets into something else the HHS secretary talked about, then you're going to get out of the business. And this is why we have these shortages. This was framed around insulin. It was framed around vaccines like the shingle vaccine. So there's all sort of like just crazy shortages that are happening. Big topic there. Then they actually got into a conversation about e-cigarettes.
Oh, interesting.
And so I've got a crazy stat for you. This is insane. The FDA has received over 27 million applications for vaping products.
27 million. Okay.
Yes. Only 23. They've only approved 23 of them. And they've gone through 99% of the applications. So
so there are 26
yes. Yeah. I mean, yeah. So just totally crazy. He highlighted that it's not in their power to make vaping illegal. There's all sorts of questions about, the benefit of vaping versus combustible nicotine. He did say that they would be having some announcements coming out soon, some rules around menthol and flavored cigars. He expected to get sued over them, but that these rules would be announced here pretty soon. So that was pretty interesting. And then there was a conversation about digital health, which really very, very quickly moved to large language models. I was shocked at how fast we went from digital health to large language models. There was almost no discussion about all the other modalities of digital health. And effectively, he said, I think what we've been saying since we started this show, the big opportunity for LLMs, the initial opportunity is in the operations, right? Physicians spending 80% of their time keying in information is just ridiculous. So we need to definitely get LLMs in there to free up physicians to do the key work. He said LLMs in the drug discovery process is not really a focus, or maybe even FDA territory. But I think this will get into something we'll talk about later in the show. Using LLMs for clinical decisions does get into FDA territory. But that the key problem is that there's not, this circles back to the translation problem, there's not adequate outcomes tracking, right? And so, the longitudinal data you would need to really be able to assess this is kind of different than you would get in a clinical trial. Right. If that makes sense.
Now, everyone's using it in different ways, if they're using it at all, and there's no standards.
Correct. So his last note on this was that we probably will need public-private partnerships to regulate LLMs, which I thought was interesting.
It's going to be hard.
Yeah, that was interesting. And then his final note of the whole thing was, which kind of was like a throwback to all the COVID times, was he said the anti-science movement is real and dangerous, and that we need non-governmental organizations to combat this. And then his final thing was, and that requires courage, because when you do stand up for science, your life can be threatened. So kind of a somber note to have ended his, I thought so. But I think it just kind of shows he started by talking about how divided the country is, and he ended talking about, the biggest threat is the anti-science movement. And so that is certainly the position of the FDA under this administration.
Yeah. Well, and it might be useful just to touch on, he was commissioner, and then he took off several years, 3 to 5 years, I can't remember. And
5 years.
5 years. And I think he was working at Google. He was working at one of the big tech firms.
Yeah.
So he really understands the tech community in a way that most commissioners don't.
Correct. Yes. He worked at Alphabet, and he worked at Alphabet, and he mentioned that when he was talking about interoperability, and he said, listen, I worked at Alphabet for 5 years. I can tell you interoperability is not a tech issue.
Right.
It's an economic interest issue. Until we can fix that with some kind of, regulation, we're going to continue to have these silos of data, which will ultimately have all these repercussions that ultimately lead to the inability to get treatments for the thousands of diseases out there that today have no treatments. So,
right. Yeah. In the Wall Street Journal, I think it was Friday. I believe it was Friday. It might have been Saturday. They published a story about a nurse who's an oncology nurse. She was overridden by an AI system telling her that it thought her patient had sepsis, and she has treated leukemia patients for a long time. The reason it flagged it for the person for sepsis is they had a really low white blood cell count, which kind of makes sense. But also, if you have leukemia, you automatically have a low white blood cell count. And so she had to go through, she had to draw blood, she had to send it for testing, she had to do a bunch of things that were at least a delay and, generated some cost and inconvenience for her as a busy nurse and for the patient. And so the Wall Street Journal wrote this article sort of interviewing her and questioning, do we want AI overruling an experienced nurse? What's the role of AI? And I think it's just I don't know that there's a real answer. And she was very in the article. She was very friendly. She's not a tech hater, but she also has treated cancer patients for a long time. And in her words, I know sepsis when I see it, and this was not a use of time funding or anything. And so that's one side of the story. And then also this week, the gastroenterology trade group, which, I have not spent a lot of time with the gastroenterology trade group. It's the American Society of Gastrointestinal and Endoscopy. They came out with a publication, Keep the Guardrails On, and then they also formed a task group of all docs to leverage AI and use AI. I guess they have in their image analysis, gastroenterologists have used AI for a couple of years, so this is not new to them. And they see a lot of value in it, but they clearly want the doc in control. And so they've set up this task force that I just thought was a really kind of a good bookend to the Wall Street Journal story of kind of how the healthcare industry can and should take control of this. It doesn't mean these docs pictured here. If you're listening, just an audio, there are 6 docs, 5 in the U.S., and they're I went and looked at the biographies. They're all very experience, huge CVs, and then they have one from Italy, so they do have an international piece. And I just wanted to kind of highlight it because it came out this week, but also I think it's a great example. There are every specialty has their own society. They're certainly capable of forming task force to use AI where it is really helpful, but not let it go off the rails, as they said in their article. So anyway, I think that is sort of the two sides of this debate playing out in the last week.
Well, so in this case, I think what's illuminated for me here is that we are correctly referencing AI in both situations. However, my sense is that there's two different flavors of AI being discussed here, and I'm not even sure that either one is really even the one that has caused the most the most anxiety over the last couple of months, which is really generative AI and these large language models. Any AI that's been used for the last 2-3 years to do pattern matching with images, it's AI, it's a model, it's probably largely sort of algorithmic, but it's not the same form of AI that we're really sort of freaking out about today, right? And so
Right.
this just gets into an entire education process where I think because things get so quickly politicized, and this is a topic that I think you could probably argue should be politicized to some degree. AI, I think, is going to be misunderstood. The different flavors of it, the different applications of it, and I think your point here is an important one, which is in this form of AI that really is a true tool, right? That doctors have been using to identify things based on images, based on being able to match against huge databases of other images that have been, coded against positive or negative, diagnosis of particular diseases, polyps, et cetera. That's a very, very different thing than running data through, a machine and it trying to determine what the next right step is from a clinical perspective for a patient.
So I agree, and I also want to add to that. So I agree that both of these examples start with artificial intelligence, what expert systems used to be called, or data prediction systems. You and I know people here in Nashville that created the first sepsis sensing tool, and the company was sold and very successful. That was 9 years ago. And it was not using a large language model. It was using a lot of data. But I think the Society of Gastrointestinal Endoscopy, I can't say the words, they are taking it a step further. So in their article, and we'll link to it in the show notes, but they recognize that AI has been a part of the practice, especially in imaging, as you're referencing, for a long time. But they also are trying to take control of the large language models they literally call out back office and administrative work. But there's kind of a slippery slope or it's not clear where the back office ends. For instance, the clinician notes, and then that translates to billing. And then if you need to fight a claim with a payer, that's all back office, but there's a lot of doctor sensitivity to some of those things.
Right.
And so what I liked about this is they're taking a kind of a proactive approach. They want to be, like they call it, like keep it in between the guardrails. I had this image of these 6 docs driving the bus or driving the industry in the direction they want it to go that will deliver better medicine, better outcomes, but also leverage the tools. But I think you're exactly right. The story from the Wall Street Journal was, a little bit of grabbing an AI headline that has been going on for a long time because of the political environment. So I think it's kind of both ends.
Yeah, and I would expect, and I'm going to try to connect two dots here, but I would expect that this is the kind of steps that Commissioner Califf was talking about when he talked about public-private partnerships, right? He was a practicing physician. I think he wants physicians to be taking a leadership role in this regulatory process of these large language models, but he knows it can't happen entirely within the walls of the FDA. So I think, when he talks about the private side, I'm sure he's anticipating there's going to be companies, but I'm sure he thinks that these physician groups, these physician industry groups are going to be very, very important players in this process.
Yeah, they're really best suited to at least contribute to how these things are put together, so that it is
right
as safe as it can be. I mean, all medicine has some risk with it, but we want to make sure that the benefits are well in excess of the risk, right? So you're going to use tools that do a lot more. It's not that you're never going to have a patient die, but we want to make sure it's much better than it was previously.
And we can talk about the control mechanism here, but really what this represents to me is a commitment between these 5 doctors that represent 5 very prestigious organizations, probably to share data, right? So there's this is the way, and it's a really interesting thing because it's part of this American ethos. De Tocqueville wrote about this in Democracy in America. Basically said our democracy actually is very, very dysfunctional and ultimately leads to tyranny because we have this majority rule thing, but we get everything done in America through associations, which is our unique superpower that the rest of the world doesn't really understand. You know what I mean? And it's interesting, right? That we can't actually through the political mechanism actually get interoperability to where it needs to be. So we have these different physician affinity organizations coming together, basically saying, okay, we all agree we're going to share this data because it's in our shared best interest and it's in the best interest of the patients we're taking care of, right? And it's that's how you actually get the interoperability.
Yeah, and I took it down, but it's Boston, New York, Seattle, Kansas City. There are 2 in Seattle, but for the most part, it's spread around the country, and then they pulled in Italy. I think they will share at least best practices and the ways, the methodologies, the procedures where they can leverage AI in a good way, or at least recommend practices do that. And then I think
they're going to share results.
They have to share sort of some of the underlying data that allows it to work.
I think they're going to share results. And the if there was one takeaway I had, it was that the ability to effectively regulate AI is going to be dependent on outcomes tracking, which is something we're terrible at in the United States. In fact, Commissioner Califf was regularly referencing how he has to go to Israel first, or even Abu Dhabi, because their systems are such that when they roll something out into Gen Pop, they can track it because they've got these unified systems and it's integrated and they can track outcomes, right? Whereas here, it's all siloed, it's all independent. There's economic interest to keep it that way. And so literally these organizations saying, hey, we want to have this control. Well, what does that mean? That control as a group means we have to share the outcomes. I think that's what I'm reading into it. Yeah. And I think this is a good thing. We need to see this happen more and more and more amongst different specialty groups, amongst primary care physicians, et cetera.
We need the cardiac surgeons and the cardiologists. We need every specialty to figure out, do they want to use AI at all or not, and in what way?
Yes.
And the docs, and then even the nurses to some extent need to sort of contribute, probably more so than the technologists. The technologists can make whatever they want happen. Right? They'll be important, but they're not going to really shape it. I don't think they should shape it.
Yep, agree. All right. Anything else you want to cover here? No, otherwise, I'll just wrap up with.
Yeah. So wrap up with.
Okay. Cool. Yeah. So HHS Secretary Javier Becerra, he sort of closed out the day in the main room, and it was interesting, the difference between Commissioner Califf and Secretary Becerra, just where we started. So we started the HHS discussion around the fact that he had just met with the G7 and was about to go to Geneva to meet with the World Health Assembly, and it was a conversation about the pandemic preparedness, right? And our ability to align and collaborate across different countries now that we are in the post-mortem phase of a pandemic that proves to us what we all know, right? It's like we have these nation states and we somehow act like borders and nation states and things of this nature have any actual bearing on our, connectiveness as a species on this planet. And oh, by the way, it doesn't. Right, exactly. So then you have to sort of talk about how you navigate, these geopolitical realities against science, and it just seems so silly, right? But then you also have to sort of think about some worst case scenarios. Now I'm saying something that he did not say. He did talk about China. He did talk about how data sharing remains an issue, and he talked about the fact that he wishes there was a better relationship with China. Even around getting clarity around the origins of COVID. Okay, right? We know that there's still lack of clarity around that, but we also know that biowarfare is at least a looming threat amongst the many different forms of warfare, cyber, nuclear, guns, etc. But bio is in there, right? And so just the idea that we can't presume that as these, biological, pandemics are unleashed on the global population, that they are not actually part of warfare, is that's such a difficult truth to wrestle with in a conversation about healthcare.
Moving from kind of a unipolar, the U.S. and all of our friends, pretty dominant around the globe, peaking at the turn of the century, to now, I don't see a future where it's not multipolar, with the U.S. being a strong and our friends being a strong component, but not the only one. I think there'll be several other things. And then we don't have good visibility to what the other players are doing in economics, in warfare, in health, in anything.
Yeah. So we started there with the fact that that's a big component of the work that he's doing right now. There wasn't much more to say about that. He did talk about.
Picture for the audience. Who is it that interviewed him this week?
Oh, I'm forgetting her name. Let me pull it up from the app, but I'll keep talking as I pull it up. Yeah. Well, no. I remember Bertha Coombs, so I want to be able to say her name as well. But anyway, one comment that he did make about global partnerships was there was this sense that Secretary Becerra was much more political and talked about President Biden much more definitively. I don't think I really heard Commissioner Califf mention Biden's name one time. So there was this clear difference between the two from a partisan perspective.
He's more of a political appointee than the FDA commissioner.
I think so. Yeah, I think so. And so he talked about the fact that from a global partnerships perspective, as he's going out and he's talking to people, there is a sense that America is back, meaning we're back at the table, we're back in partnerships, and there is this question as to whether or not we're going to stay at the table. So obviously we have an election that's looming, building up for next year. Elizabeth Cohen, senior medical correspondent for CNN, was who interviewed him. She did a great job. Okay, so
on that point,
we started with the whole.
I mean, maybe that's true. I don't think we have a choice but to stay in this conversation. I don't care who the president is. I think we should be in the conversation.
Well, clearly, Trump had a very, Trump's whole thing was America first, and he definitely had a different foreign policy perspective as it pertained to all of these things. So I think without getting too much into what was the right perspective, what was the wrong perspective.
The best strategy. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. Well, okay. I'm going to avoid that and just sort of highlight that. Yeah. I think what I would just say is he was acknowledging something that I think you and I saw back in 2019 when we were traveling to the UK, right?
Yeah.
Pretty regularly, right? The perspective that the world had when Trump was in office, it was pretty strong. There's pretty strong feelings about his perspective from a foreign policy, view.
Yeah.
So I think he was addressing that.
I don't view it as just so I don't get a ton of hate mail. I don't view it as Democrat or Republican. I think if the world is bifurcating to multipolar, we have to be in the conversation from whatever side you're on. And
Totally,
that's
totally.
my opinion. I don't think it's Democrat or Republican. But anyway, so anyway, keep going.
Yeah. Okay. Then the next topic, which actually reminds me, I should talk about this. The next topic was around gender affirming care, which very quickly got into reproductive health. I want to just step back and talk about this conference. Like half of this agenda is about women's health. Like not kidding, not over exaggerating. The titles, the panels, the setup, and they were pretty unapologetic about that at the opening plenary session. That they've programmed this, largely to give voice to a conversation that needs voice right now. I think there's no question that is a Dobbs-driven, sort of agenda. So I just wanted to point out that I can't remember ever going to a healthcare conference where half the agenda that wasn't specifically focused on women's health, where half the agenda was women's health oriented.
Yeah.
And certainly this event has a very strong allocation of the agenda to women's health. So started to get into gender affirming care. This section kind of got pretty political. It was talking about the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeal, just generally how these things are bouncing around in the circuit courts, and we're in a bit of a state of limbo right now between the states and the federal government as it pertains to gender affirming care. I think he was pretty clear. The Biden administration is going to use every federal tool they can to ensure that gender affirming care is something that is available at the states, but clearly they have limits and clearly the courts have a say in this. And so it's sort of an ongoing situation. It was not a definitive conversation, but it was brought up. It moved pretty quickly to reproductive health, and then there was a discussion around. It was more of a story they started telling about when he was in St. Louis at Planned Parenthood, for some of the final abortions that were delivered right before the final verdict came down, and then they had to start calling people and telling them that they weren't going to be able to provide any more abortion care. And he sort of highlighted that 15 minutes away in Illinois, it was totally there, and just sort of highlighting we are in this sort of states' rights moment in America, which is it truly is pretty new for me. I mean, I remember I grew up in New York. The one issue I remember being a sort of definitive, where certain states had certain rules and other states didn't, was around guns. Because I grew up in New York where you couldn't have guns, but I always knew in the South you could have guns, right? So, but outside of that, I felt like for the most part the states had pretty uniform rules around things, and from state to state you could kind of expect the same thing. And I think he was highlighting that we are moving into this era where from state to state, you're going to have very, very different rules. And I don't believe it's limited to just, I don't believe it's limited to just healthcare. I think education obviously is another area where we're seeing, striking differences, based on which party is in control of a particular state. So just more highlighting the division.
In general, I think that allows for lots of A/B testing of all kinds of policies. But when you get to health, it can be much more personal. It's much more, it's less of a, intellectual, like, so tax law, for instance.
Right.
I would say it's healthy to have 50 different
Yes.
tax plans. And then we sort of learned from all those different experiences. In healthcare, especially when you get to abortion, choice and not choice,
Mm-hmm.
or gender affirming, those are really personal and emotionally charged issues. And then taking that to an A/B testing thing is just a lot harder. It's a lot more fraught with hard feelings. So I don't know that we're going to resolve this right now, but I like the structure of the federal and state. But then when you get to healthcare, it gets much more complex.
Yeah, yeah, and I think he just through story tried to illustrate how difficult that can be, and it also sort of showed the limits of his power, right? In a time like this to actually affect change across the country. Started a conversation about prescription drugs. So, I don't know if this was a bit of an announcement. I hadn't been tracking it, but he said in the very near future, the first 10 drugs that the U.S. is going to negotiate drug prices on will be announced. This is a brand new law. This was not allowable before. And he said, once they're done with these 10 next year, they expect to have another 15 and kind of go on and on and on. He said he personally has already been sued by the pharma industry, the U.S. Chamber, Merck, and he wasn't committal on Bristol Myers, but the crowd kept saying Bristol Myers was the fourth party that has filed suit against him.
We should
so
talk to Emily about this.
That name.
I think the 95% excise tax thing is definitely going to go to the courts. That's a hard.
He said the whole thing's going to the Supreme Court. He said this is where it's headed. But he is going to do it. He's going to negotiate drug prices on behalf of Medicare and Medicaid, which I think is
I don't think anyone questions.
It's a watershed moment.
He should be able to do that.
Well, hold on. Clearly, the pharma industry, the U.S. Chamber, Merck, and potentially Bristol Myers do question because they're suing him about it. So I just want to highlight, clearly there are those who do oppose this. He was very pointed to talk about the suits, and I think it's important to note we certainly don't have clarity on how the courts might rule on this in this kind of situation.
Well, we need to pull Emily in, but I think that what people are upset about is if the negotiation fails, right? Like negotiations work best when it is reasonably balanced. Like the U.S. is a huge buyer, and he should negotiate. I would say that's clear. But if they can't come to terms, then it kicks into this. They put a 95% tax on the price of the drug, and that's what people are upset about because it's we're going to negotiate, but we don't have to really try. Anyway, we should have him talk about that because she'll be much better than I am.
Yeah, I think this entire topic of the Inflation Reduction Act, its impact on the pharma industry, innovation drugs versus generic drugs, the negotiation of drug prices, Civica. There's an entire thing here I think we need to start to dig into. It was illuminated for me this week. This was the big area that I had not been focusing on very much, and now in retrospect, I'm realizing this is a massive aspect of U.S. healthcare that I need to better understand from an innovation perspective to know, where are the opportunities and what are the challenges this is going to present.
Well, it's partly because we don't do life sciences investing, but it affects everything. So we do need to learn about it.
It affects everything. That your reason for why we don't focus on it is correct, and it affects everything, and we still need to be better dialed into it. And then I would say the last topic was this combination of behavioral health and gun violence. So another theme that has come up several times over the course of my time here in Aspen has been gun violence as a healthcare issue, being articulated by emergency room physicians who work in inner cities and regularly have to deal with gun violence trauma as a healthcare issue, and how obviously in the political lobbying space, the NRA has fought pretty hard to try to say this is not a healthcare issue and doesn't have any bearing. And so the reason why I'm starting there before I go to behavioral health is because some of the things that the HHS secretary was talking about that they've done are things like they've sent money to schools after a school shooting, right? And so the obvious question is, okay, well, why can't you send the money there beforehand? And the reason is because obviously the difference in the the states' rights versus the Fed, but also just this general limitation to the ability to consider gun violence as a healthcare issue, right? And all of the ripple effects that happen as a result of gun violence. The behavioral health issues that happen in the aftermath of gun violence. And that's something I think you and I understand, better than maybe we previously did,
Yeah.
because of Covenant and the people we know who. Right, and the people that we know who have been affected, who, you and I both know a lot of people actually, who have families who were impacted through that. And I think we both know they have a long road to walk, from a behavioral health perspective, right? And it's like that's healthcare, right? I mean, that the aftermath of that is going to affect health outcomes for people, period. End of story. There's no other way to sort of slice it. And so that was just, I've been thinking about gun violence largely from the political lens of gun control and, red flag laws and all those types of things, not thinking about the healthcare implications of it. I mean, obviously thinking about the trauma, but not necessarily thinking about the impact to the healthcare system, the expense to the healthcare system that it creates. And so that was a topic, and honestly, it wasn't that encouraging, to hear sort of his remarks on it, because it just doesn't sound like there's much that can really be done from the perspective of HHS as an entity.
I mean, I agree that it causes a ton of behavioral health issues, but I think behavioral health is a really terrible, huge problem with many, many causes. And gun violence is certainly one, but there's alcohol and drug addiction. There's the stress and anxiety and pressure and family life, and there's all kinds of things that are contributing to the behavioral health. Really kind of.
I think the difference is that those things that you mentioned are considered to be proper healthcare matters.
Yeah.
That was the point. That was the point.
Yeah. So we should include gun violence as a healthcare topic.
As a proper healthcare issue, yes, as a proper healthcare issue. That was the thing that I hadn't really contemplated before, is that all the other things that we generally associate with behavioral health, you talked about it, substance abuse issues, domestic violence, all these other kinds of things, they do happen to generally fall into the healthcare, bucket.
Yeah.
And gun violence has been excluded, and it's been excluded intentionally and politically. So that
homelessness in there too. I mean, I think homelessness is a behavioral health.
Totally agree. So that was, there was a lot of conversation around 988, and he mentioned, I actually wanted to do some sourcing on this, but he threw out the stat that text-based therapy is up 1,000%. And so I wanted to kind of see, okay, is that with teens specifically? He mentioned teens, but like, is that with teens specifically? In what time frame is it up 1,000%? Is it up is it up somewhat because of the rise of telemedicine during COVID, because of emergency use authorization? So I wanted to understand that a little bit better, but still, the idea of text-based therapy being up 1,000% is a really big deal. And then also talked about the issues from a cultural competency perspective when it comes to behavioral health, and how Black and Brown communities just suffer more from an access, availability, cultural competency perspective. So that was also mentioned. Oh, final thing, I'm going to shift away from behavioral health. The final thing was Medicaid redetermination. So I didn't fully understand this. I thought he did a good job of simplifying the issue. During COVID, states were allowed to just basically cover everybody. And that just meant eligibility checks, which were sort of an annual thing that everyone was sort of used to, were waived. Well, they were waived for 3 straight years. And now we're about to go back into eligibility checks, and 15 to 17 million people are likely unaware of that and could lose coverage. And so literally, this is a communication campaign. It's an engagement and communication campaign. That's really all it is. That it's not fundamentally about the status of the emergency, event going away or any of that other kind of stuff. It's mostly about, do these people know they're going to get something in the mail, and when they get this thing in the mail, they actually need to respond to it, or are they just going to, toss it to the side? And
the question is, how many of them have gotten a job where they have coverage, or they have coverage some other way, and so they throw it out because they don't care, and how many throw it out and they actually need it? I'm not sure that the states are going to be able to distinguish between those people. So they got to figure.
This was the problem.
Yeah.
This was the problem he was highlighting. Was it's actually going to just be a challenge, right? It's a communication challenge. He was very careful to not fault the states. He said, some states are probably going to do a better job than others. We're doing our best to try to support the states in this effort, but just thinking about what the fallout could be from over 10 million people losing their Medicaid coverage and potentially not having new coverage that has been picked up because they've got healthcare through a job or something like that. That's a pretty scary prospect.
From the kind of the opposite point of view. So I think that is going to be a communication challenge. I think what happens is when you need care, you don't have coverage, and the health systems will then re-sign you up. There's a lot of loss and issues there with individual people. But the other side that I've been really looking into is that a lot of payers have been able to bill for this because they have Medicaid enrollment, and some of those people, some percentage, have gotten jobs elsewhere, and so they don't have coverage anymore, even though the states funded by the federal government are still paying for it. So it's a negative to all the payers that have exposure there. And I've been looking at that with Emily most of them are publicly traded, so it doesn't really affect venture assets. There are some small payers. And so that's the other side of it, that they're getting paid for these people, but they're not getting care through that system. And they don't even necessarily know they have it anymore because they have moved on and they have employer-based care. So there's going to be a sort of a sifting out of this, but it's going to be negative to the payers that have a lot of exposure. So like Centene has a lot of exposure there. I don't know what percentage it is, but it's not zero that they're gonna lose that kind of high margin subscriber base.
Interesting. All right. Well, that is my recap from Aspen Ideas Health of the FDA commissioner and the HHS secretary. So hopefully that was interesting, or
I thought it was great. So hopefully the audience will like it. And we are trying to be apolitical, but when you're talking to appointed officials, you end up getting all kinds of information that's really valuable. So if people don't like it, tough.
Yeah. I think we generally try to call it down the middle, but yes, there are clearly things that are partisan, and I think it's important to track them because they really will come into question next year as we get into the election cycle, and we really start to contemplate, which is totally unclear right now. I mean, there's so much crazy stuff going on. I mean, between Hunter Biden and RFK Jr. and Trump and the indictments. I mean,
interview with Hannity, that was amazing.
Yes, it was amazing.
I mean, I don't love Gavin, but he did an incredible job. He really did.
He crushed it.
Yeah, he crushed it.
He crushed it. Yeah. So we have a wide open field.
I mean, I don't know why he doesn't run, but I do know why. I just don't like it.
I think he's just waiting for the opening. Clearly, he's just waiting for the opening. Yeah. Anyway, look, full week. You are not going to be around next week.
I'm here next week. I'm on the next week.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah. I'm here. I'm here on the 29th, but I'm gone over 4th of July.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, I'm having Dave Johnson come up to the studio anyway.
Okay. Well,
next Tuesday. So I'm going to record something with him, and then we'll record next Thursday. Okay.
All
right.
Thanks, man. Some of the back end of this, but if you lasted this long, you hear the inside baseball of it.
Yeah, look, it's just the two of us trying to figure out how to like keep this thing going week to week. All right, man. I'm headed to dinner. I will see you next week.
Okay, thanks. Bye.
Bye.